You didn't write this. The words landed in the middle of a silent classroom like something thrown hard against glass. Excuse me, she said. I said you didn't write this. Professor Gerald Whitmore dropped the paper onto the desk in front of her the way you drop something you don't want to touch. 43 pages, spiral-bound, 8 months of work. And he let it fall like it was nothing, like it was less than nothing. A 19-year-old from. He paused, and the pause was its own sentence. Your background doesn't produce work like this, so I'm giving you a 0 for academic dishonesty, and I'm recommending you to the disciplinary board. She didn't flinch. She looked at the paper on the desk, and then she looked at him, and her voice, when it came, was perfectly level. I'd like to know which part you believe I didn't write. He didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the front of the room. Nobody in that classroom said a word. 22 students staring at their desks, at the walls, at their hands. A young woman in the second row looked up once and then looked away. A young man near the window opened his mouth and then closed it. The paper stayed on the desk. 43 pages. Her name on the cover in plain black type. 8 months of her life. What no one in that room knew, what Professor Gerald Whitmore, with his 3 decades of tenure and his named chair and his absolute certainty, could not have imagined, was that those 43 pages had already been read by someone else, somewhere else, and that 3 days from now, a phone would ring in a mathematics department office 1,200 miles away that would change everything in this room. Have you ever worked harder than you have? Ever worked for anything in your life? And had someone look at what you built and tell you it couldn't possibly be yours? Let me take you back. 7 months before that classroom, before the paper, before the 0. Let me tell you who she was and where she came from and what she was carrying when she walked through those doors. Her name was Josephina Daisy Okafor, Jo to everyone who loved her, which was a precise and carefully chosen group of people. She had grown up in the Linwood Park neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, in a house on Meridian Street that was narrow and warm and smelled, depending on the day, like frying plantains or like the particular pine-scented cleaner her mother used on Sunday mornings when the whole house got remade from floor to ceiling before church. The house had 3 bedrooms and 5 people in it for most of Jo's childhood. Her mother, Gloria. Her grandmother, Mama Chidinma, who had come from Enugu in 1987 and never fully stopped orienting herself toward Nigeria the way a compass orients toward north. Her 2 younger brothers, Felix and Emmanuel, and Jo herself, who occupied the smallest bedroom with a single bed, a desk that her uncle had found at a garage sale and carried home on his back, and a wall covered so densely in handwritten equations that her mother had once stood in the doorway and said with genuine bewilderment, "Baby, what is all of this?" "Math," Jo had said. "I know it's math. Why is it on my wall?" "Because there's not enough paper." Gloria Okafor worked as a medical billing specialist for a hospital network downtown. She left the house at 6:45 every morning and came home at 6:15 every evening. And somewhere in the space between those 2 times, she also managed to be, as far as Jo could tell, the organizational center of the entire known universe. She packed lunches. She tracked immunization records. She called teachers back within the hour. She sat at the kitchen table on Tuesday nights doing budgets in a green ledger book with a mechanical pencil, moving numbers around with the focused patience of a woman who understood that the difference between $43 and $48 was the difference between a school supply list being complete and a child going without. She never complained about the numbers. She just moved them. Jo had understood from a very young age that her mother was doing something extraordinary by refusing to let scarcity become the story. The story in their house was always possibility. The story was, you do the work, you do it well, and you don't let anybody convince you that the ceiling they see for you is the ceiling that exists. Mama Chidinma had a different way of saying the same thing. She said it in Igbo, and she said it often, and the translation Jo carried with her was roughly this: the tree does not apologize for its height. Jo had been exceptional at mathematics since she was 7 years old, which was when her second-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Hooks, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept a jar of butterscotch candies on her desk, had pulled Gloria aside after school one afternoon and said, "Mrs. Okafor, I need you to understand that your daughter is doing something I have not seen before." Mrs. Hooks had been teaching second grade for 22 years. She did not say things like that lightly. What Joe was doing was solving problems from a fourth grade workbook that Mrs. Hooks had brought from home to see what would happen. Joe had worked through it in 40 minutes, during recess, sitting at her desk while the other children were outside, and when Mrs. Hooks came back and looked at the completed pages, she stood very still for a moment and then sat down in the small chair next to Joe's small desk and said, "Can you show me how you did this one?" Joe had shown her. Mrs. Hooks got her placed in an accelerated program that the Cleveland Public School District ran on Saturday mornings. It was not a flashy program. It met in a school building that needed new windows. The materials were photocopied, and sometimes the ink was light. But the teachers were people who genuinely loved what they were teaching, and Joe went every Saturday for 6 years, and what she developed there, in that slightly cold room with the light ink photocopies and the teachers, who stayed late, was not just skill but a way of thinking, a way of seeing the architecture inside problems. The way a problem is always, underneath its surface, a structure, and structures can be understood, and structures, once understood, can sometimes be rebuilt into something that didn't exist before. Her high school math teacher, a man named Mr. Darnell Pierce, who had a master's degree in applied mathematics and had turned down a doctoral program to come back and teach in Cleveland because he believed, with the conviction of a man who had been somebody's Mr. Pierce when he was young, that the place you came from deserved what you knew. Mr. Pierce had told Joe in her junior year, quietly after class, "You need to be somewhere that can keep up with you." He meant a university. He meant specifically, and he said this carefully, understanding what it would mean for a family running a green ledger book, that there were schools with full scholarship programs for students like Joe, that there were people who had set money aside specifically so that a girl from Linwood Park who saw the architecture inside problems wouldn't have to stop seeing it just because of what was in a ledger. He helped her apply. He wrote her a recommendation letter that was 4 pages long, which was 3 pages longer than any recommendation letter the admissions offices were used to receiving, and which one admissions reader at a university in western Pennsylvania later described to a colleague as the most assured piece of academic advocacy I have read in 20 years. Joe got a full scholarship to Carver University, full tuition, full room and board, a stipend for books and materials. The scholarship was named after a donor who had made her money in logistics and believed, with the particular intensity of a woman who had been told no too many times to count, that the most important investment a person could make was in a young mind that someone else had decided to underestimate. Joe arrived at Carver in August with a duffel bag and a backpack and her grandmother's Bible, small, black, its cover worn to the texture of old skin, its margins filled with Mama Chidinma's handwriting in a mix of English and Igbo, tucked into the outside pocket of the backpack where she could reach it easily. She had declared her major before she arrived. Mathematics, with a focus on number theory and combinatorial structures. Her academic advisor during orientation week had looked at her course selection and said, pleasantly but with a certain weight, "These are ambitious choices for a first-year student." Joe had looked at him and said, "I know," and had not changed any of them. She did well, more than well, but doing well was not the story. The story was what happened in the spring semester of her second year, when she enrolled in Professor Gerald Whitmore's advanced topics in analytic number theory. Whitmore was, professionally speaking, significant. He had been at Carver for 31 years. He held the Aldrich Patterson Chair in mathematics, which was an endowed position and came with a plaque and an office with a window. He had published 2 monographs that were cited regularly in graduate seminars. He had trained a number of doctoral students who had gone on to respectable positions. He was, within the particular world of his department, a figure of genuine standing. He was also a man whose understanding of who was capable of what had calcified in exactly the way that 31 years inside a comfortable institution can calcify a person's understanding. If they are not careful, if they do not keep reaching, if they mistake the patterns of the past for the laws of the present. He had, in his 31 years, never given an A to a first or second-year undergraduate in advanced topics. He had said at a faculty meeting the previous year that the course self-selects for a certain kind of student, and the certain kind of student he had in mind was legible to everyone in the room, even if no one said so out loud. Jo Okafor enrolled in the course and sat in the third row and said very little in the first 3 weeks because she was listening. She was learning the architecture of the room, the same way she learned the architecture of problems, where the resistance was, where the load was being carried, what the structure was actually made of underneath what it claimed to be. In the fourth week, she asked a question. It was a question about a gap in a proof Whitmore had presented on the board, not an aggressive question, a precise one. She asked it the way you ask a question when you have looked at something long enough to see that the thing holding it together is not what it appears to be. Whitmore paused. He looked at the board. He said, "That's not a gap, that's a simplification for classroom purposes," Jo said. "I understand. But if you expand the simplification, does the gap resolve?" The class was quiet. Whitmore said, "We'll move on." But the gap was real. 2 students in the class looked it up afterward. It was real. It was minor, a known shortcut that technically elided a step that most graduate students filled in automatically. But it was real, and Jo had seen it in 4 weeks when students had been walking past it for years. Whitmore had seen her see it, and something shifted in him, not toward her, away. The semester's major assignment was a final paper. Students were given a list of open problems in analytic number theory, not homework problems, not textbook exercises, but genuine open problems, questions in the field that had not been fully answered, and were asked to select one, research the existing literature, and produce original analysis. The paper was worth 40% of the final grade. Whitmore had included one problem on the list almost as a placeholder, a problem that had resisted a specific class of approach for over 2 decades. He had included it, he later told a colleague, because the graduate students always ask why no one has tried X approach, and this is a good way to show them why. It was, in his estimation, a problem that would produce instructive failure, a problem whose resistance was itself the lesson. Jo chose that problem. She had been thinking about it in various forms since she was 16 years old, when Mr. Pierce had shown her a paper that touched on adjacent territory. She had not known, at 16, what she was thinking about. She had not had the language. She had just known that there was something there, something in the architecture, a way the structure was balancing its weight, that nobody seemed to be looking at from quite the right angle. Now she had the language. Now she had 2 years of university mathematics and 6 years of Saturday mornings and the accumulated understanding of a person who had been looking at the same structure from multiple angles for a long time. She worked on the paper for 8 months, which was technically 6 months past the end of the semester, because she had filed for a research extension through the dean's office, which Whitmore had grudgingly approved because the process required him to approve it, and refusing would have required a justification he didn't have. She worked at the desk in her dorm room and at a table in the library that she had quietly claimed through sheer consistency of presence, and at the kitchen table at home in Cleveland over winter break, while her mother ran the green ledger book and her grandmother read the Bible in the small circle of lamplight, and Felix and Emmanuel argued about something in the next room. She talked to Mr. Pierce on the phone twice during the process. She did not tell him what she was working on, specifically. She just needed to hear the voice of someone who had always believed that the ceiling other people saw for her was not the ceiling that existed. She finished the paper in late March, 43 pages, meticulous notation, a proof that approached the problem from an angle that, as far as she could determine from her literature review, no one had tried before, not because it was exotic or revolutionary in its tools, but because it required holding 2 things in mind simultaneously that researchers had consistently treated as separate questions. She had seen the connection at 16, without knowing what she was seeing. She had spent 8 months turning that seeing into something that could be demonstrated. She submitted it through the department's official paper submission system. with a timestamp with her name on the cover page, with 43 pages of notation and bibliography, and her own careful handwriting, visible in the revision history that the submission system automatically logged. She had also, and this was a habit Mr. Pierce had taught her, the habit of a man who had learned that exceptional work from unexpected places sometimes needed its provenance protected. Emailed a copy to herself and to Mr. Pierce and her university academic advisor the same day she submitted. Time-stamped, documented. She had the DNA of her thinking in her own submission history, in her research notes, in the margin notes in 3 different textbooks that she could produce at any moment. She waited 3 weeks for a response. What she got was a meeting request from Whitmore's assistant. She went to the meeting. Whitmore had the paper on his desk. He had read it. She could see that he had read it. There were marks on several pages, small notations in the margins. He had read it carefully. He looked at her across the desk and he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer." She waited. "Did you write this paper yourself?" She felt the question land. She felt in the space of about 2 seconds everything that question was actually asking. She felt the weight of 31 years of calcified certainty sitting across a desk from her. She said, "Yes, because this paper," he pushed it slightly toward her, not handing it, just moving it, "claims to do something that researchers with significant resources and advanced positions have not been able to do, and you are a second-year undergraduate." "I'm aware of what I am," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to walk me through your derivation of the central inequality." Right now, without the paper on the board, she stood up. She went to the small whiteboard on the wall of his office. She had the derivation in her head the way a musician has a piece in their hands. Not memorized, but inhabited. She worked through it in 14 minutes. When she finished, she turned around. Whitmore was looking at the board. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This doesn't prove the paper is yours. It proves you understand the paper." And Joe Okafor understood, in that moment, that there was nothing she could demonstrate that would be sufficient. Because the problem was not evidence. The problem was that he had decided, somewhere before the evidence, that the conclusion was impossible. So he scheduled the class presentation. He had each student present their final paper to the full class, which was standard procedure. He told Joe she would present on Thursday, and that was when he handed it back to her in front of everyone and said, "You didn't write this." The classroom. The paper dropped on the desk. The 0. The disciplinary board recommendation. The 43 pages. The room full of students who did not say anything. Joe looked at the paper on the desk. She thought about her mother moving numbers in a green ledger. She thought about her grandmother's Bible in the outside pocket of her backpack. She thought about Mr. Pierce at a whiteboard in Cleveland, saying the place you came from deserves what you know. She thought about a woman she had never met who had made her money in logistics and set it aside for exactly this moment, for a girl that someone had decided to underestimate. She picked up the paper. She put it in her bag. She walked out. She did not go to the disciplinary board meeting that Whitmore had scheduled. She did something else. She went to the library. She opened her laptop. She found in the proceedings of the previous year's International Congress of Mathematicians the name of a researcher whose recent work touched, not identically, but adjacently, the way 2 rivers touch before they merge, on the territory her paper was working in. The researcher's name was Dr. Amara Nwosu. She was an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics at MIT. She had been born in Lagos. She had her undergraduate degree from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and her doctorate from Princeton. And she had published 7 papers in the last 4 years that had each, quietly and without fanfare, moved the field. Joe sent her an email, not to the department, directly to Dr. Nwosu's faculty address, which was publicly listed on the MIT website. The email was 4 sentences long. It said, "My name is Josephine Okafor. I am a second-year student at Carver University in Pennsylvania. I have written a paper that I believe is relevant to the problem you examined in your 2022 ICM proceedings paper. I would be grateful for 15 minutes of your time." She attached the paper. She sent it at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. Amara Nwosu read mathematics the way some people read music, continuously as background, as foreground, as the thing she returned to, at the end of the day, the way other people return to novels. She had set up a folder for unsolicited manuscripts from students and junior researchers, and she reviewed it on Thursday mornings over coffee, giving each paper about 5 minutes before deciding whether it merited more. She opened Joe's paper at 8:14 on Thursday morning. She was still reading it at noon. She read it a second time in the afternoon. At 4:30, she forwarded it to her department chair with a message that said, "Read this," specifically pages 19 through 31. "Tell me if you see what I see." Her department chair, a man named Professor Howard Sung, who had been in mathematics long enough to have developed an almost physical sensitivity to the feeling of encountering something genuinely new, the way a person who has lived near the ocean develops a sensitivity to the particular quality of the air before a storm, read pages 19 through 31. He read them twice. He called Nwosu. The call lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, they were in agreement about what they were looking at. What they were looking at was a proof. Not a partial approach, not a promising direction. A proof, incomplete in one relatively contained section, a gap that Nwosu identified on her second reading, but otherwise sound. Otherwise doing what no approach in the preceding 23 years had managed to do, which was close the problem. From an angle so clean, so structurally elegant that Sung said to Nwosu, "Where has this person been?" And Nwosu said, "Carver University, apparently. Second year." There was a silence. Then Sung said, "We should make some calls." The call to Carver University's mathematics department came on a Friday morning, 4 days after Joe had walked out of Whitmore's classroom with her paper in her bag. It came not to Whitmore. It came to the department chair, a woman named Dr. Sandra Fleiss, who had been running the department for 6 years, and who had, on more than one occasion, looked at the distribution of Whitmore's grades and filed it in the part of her mind where things she couldn't yet prove waited for the moment when they could be. The call was from Professor Howard Sung's office at MIT. His assistant asked if Dr. Fleiss was available for a brief call with Professor Sung and Dr. Nwosu regarding a paper submitted by one of Carver's students. Dr. Fleiss was available. The call lasted 25 minutes. When it was over, Dr. Fleiss sat at her desk for a moment. She was a woman who had trained herself over years of academic administration not to react to things before she had the full picture. She took a breath. Then she called her assistant and said, "Get me Gerald Whitmore, and pull the submission records for a paper by Josephine Okafor, second year, submitted to Advanced Topics in Analytic Number Theory. I want the timestamp, the revision history, and the full submission file." The assistant pulled the file. The timestamp was there, the revision history was there. 43 pages, submitted through the official system, with a complete audit trail showing 18 months of iterative development, saved drafts, tracked changes, incremental builds from early rough outline to finished proof. Every one of them tied to Joe's university login credentials, tied to her IP address in the university network, tied to the account she had been using since the first week of her freshman year. The audit trail was, in the language of the systems administrator, who printed it out, about as clean as it gets. Fleiss looked at it for a long time. Then Whitmore came in. He sat down across from her desk, and he had the particular posture of a man who has been summoned by someone below whom he does not believe himself to be, and was managing his displeasure with the thin performance of cooperation. She told him about the call from MIT. His posture changed. She told him what Sung and Nwosu had said about the paper. His face did something. It didn't fully go white. This was not a man whose face lost color easily, a man too long upholstered in his own certainty for that. But something left it. Some of the performance, some of the weight. She told him about the audit trail. He looked at the printout she slid across the desk. She said, "Gerald, I'm going to need you to explain to me, precisely, on what basis you determined that this paper was not the work of this student." He looked at the printout for a long time. He said, "The work was beyond the expected level." Dr. Fleiss looked at him. She said, "Beyond the expected level. For a student of her what?" He didn't finish the sentence. There are silences that are verdicts, and that one was. The disciplinary board meeting that Whitmore had scheduled for Joe became, within 48 hours, a very different kind of meeting. It became a meeting involving Dr. Fleiss, the dean of the college, the university's ombudsman for academic integrity, and Joe herself. This time with documentation, with the submission audit trail, with a written statement from Professor Howard Sung and Dr. Amara Nwosu, submitted on MIT letterhead, describing the paper as a significant and original contribution to the field, and noting that they were in the process of arranging for the work to be reviewed for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. In the process of arranging for the work to be reviewed for publication, a second-year undergraduate. Whitmore sat at the end of that table with all of it in front of him, and he looked like a man in a room that was smaller than he had thought it was. The 0 was reversed that afternoon, replaced with a grade that Dr. Fleiss assigned personally, consulting with 2 outside reviewers whom she had called that morning, and both of whom had read the paper within 24 hours of receiving it, and had each independently used words like exceptional and original. The grade Dr. Fleiss assigned was the highest grade the university had a name for. Whitmore was placed on administrative review. The review expanded, as these things do when someone finally starts looking into a formal inquiry by the faculty senate, which found a pattern over his 31 years of documented grade disparities along racial lines. A pattern that had been visible in the data, in the aggregate for years, but which nobody had looked at from exactly the right angle. The way Joe had looked at the problem that Whitmore had put on his list as a placeholder for instructive failure, the inquiry resulted in formal censure. His course was removed from his teaching load pending review. 3 doctoral students who had been quietly transferred away from his supervision over the years came forward. Their accounts added texture to the picture. None of it was surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. All of it was, finally, on record. The scholarship fund. The one named for the woman who had made her money in logistics and believed in underestimated minds, was expanded. The university announced a new initiative, funded partly through the settlement of a civil complaint that Joe's family had filed with the assistance of the NOCP Legal Defense Fund, and that the university had resolved without going to trial. The initiative provided dedicated research funding for first- and second-year undergraduates pursuing original work in MST fields. It was designed specifically to give those students access to faculty mentorship outside their own department, so that no paper, no 43 pages of 8 months of work and a lifetime of seeing, could be dismissed by a single person with a single pen. The initiative was called, at Joe's quiet insistence on the name, the Raymond Webb. No, wait. It was called, at Joe's quiet insistence, the Meridian Park Scholars Program, named for the street she had grown up on. The street with the narrow, warm house that smelled like frying plantains and pine-scented cleaner on Sunday mornings. The paper was published. Dr. Nwosu served as the senior author on a revision that incorporated her own work and closed the gap in Joe's proof. And the published version listed Joe as first author because the core of it, the angle, the architecture, the seeing, was hers. It appeared in the Annals of Mathematics 11 months after that Thursday morning in Whitmore's classroom. Joe was 20 years old. The day the acceptance letter came from the journal, she called home. Her mother answered on the second ring, the way her mother always answered, like she had been waiting. Joe told her. Gloria Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, I want you to call your grandmother." Joe called her grandmother. Mama Chidinma listened to the whole thing. Then she said, in Igbo, the sentence Joe had been hearing since she was small. The one about the tree. The tree does not apologize for its height. Joe had the paper printed and bound. She sent a copy to Mr. Pierce in Cleveland with a note on the inside cover that said, "You said I needed somewhere that could keep up with me. I'm starting to think the place was always in here." She sent a copy to Mrs. Patricia Hooks, her second-grade teacher, who was retired now and living in Columbus, and who called Joe the next Sunday morning, crying in the way that people cry when something they believed for a very long time is finally confirmed by the world. She kept the original, the first printed copy. She keeps it in her desk, in a drawer, next to her grandmother's Bible. 2 years later, Joe Okafor began her doctoral program, not at Carver, at MIT, where Dr. Amara Nwosu had built a research group that was doing work at the intersection of analytic number theory and computational complexity, and where Joe had been offered a fellowship that covered everything, and asked only that she keep doing what she had always done, which was look at structures from angles that other people hadn't found yet. On her first day, she walked into a building that had more mathematics in its walls than most cities have in their histories, and she put her bag down at a desk that was now hers, and she took out her grandmother's Bible and set it in the corner where she could see it. And she thought about a desk her uncle had carried home on his back, and a wall covered in equations, and a teacher who had sat in a small chair next to a small desk and said, "Show me how you did this one." She thought about 43 pages falling on a desk like they were nothing. She opened her laptop. She started working. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something about what it means to keep building, even when someone is trying to make you believe the building isn't yours, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories like this one. And tell me something in the comments. Has anyone ever looked at your best work and decided it couldn't be yours? What did you do with that? Here's what really gets me about this story, and I've been sitting with it since I first heard it. Turning it over the way you turn something over when it hasn't finished giving up what it holds. It's not Whitmore. Whitmore is almost the least interesting thing in the story. He's just a door that needed to be pushed open, and Joe pushed it. What really gets me is the 8 months. The 8 months when no one was watching, when there was no audience, when it was just a girl at a desk in a dorm room, and at a table in the library, and at the kitchen table in Cleveland over winter break, working on a problem that someone was going to tell her she couldn't have solved. She didn't know they were going to say that. She was just working because the architecture was there, and she could see it, and not seeing it all the way through was not something she was capable of. That is the inheritance. That is what Gloria Okafor built in a house on Meridian Street with a green ledger book and a refusal to let scarcity become the story. That is what Mama Chidinma carried from Enugu in 1987 and deposited in a small Bible with handwritten margins. That is what Mr. Pierce gave up a doctoral program to be able to give. That is what Mrs. Patricia Hook saw in a second grader finishing a fourth grade workbook during recess and thought, "I have not seen this before. That is not nothing. That is a relay. That is a thing being handed forward through generations and classrooms and phone calls and folded notes that say, 'Eat something real today.'" And Joe Okafor received it, and she kept it. And when a man with a named chair and 31 years of certainty dropped it on a desk like it was nothing, she picked it up. She put it in her bag, she walked out, and then she sat down and wrote 4 sentences to a stranger at MIT. That's it. That is the whole story. 4 sentences and a belief that the work could speak for itself if she could just get it in front of someone willing to listen. So, here is my question for you, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Think about the thing you are building. The thing that is taking longer than anyone thinks it should, that no one is watching you work on, that you carry around in your head at the kitchen table and in the library and in the in-between moments of ordinary days. What would you do if you got it done and someone told you it wasn't yours? Would you fold? Or would you write 4 sentences to a stranger and trust that the work was enough? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you are in the building.